izinto zonke ezikhona zenziwa ayo le mali enelanda phansi emgodini.
Nancy Mali by Ladysmith Black Mombasa. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting live from the UN climate talks here in Durban, South Africa, called COP17. That's Conference of Parties, what some are calling Conference of Polluters. Today is supposed to be the last day of these talks. We'll see. To talk more about where this summit stands, we're joined by two guests who've been closely tracking the role of the U.S. negotiating team over the past 2 weeks, as they have previous summits. Kate Horner is a policy analyst at Friends of the Earth, and Michael Dorsey is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Kate, let's begin with you. Where do we stand on this Friday that's supposed to be the end of this 2-week summit?
We are very far from agreement, even as the conference comes to a close tonight. 4 years ago in Bali, the world agreed on a roadmap that would fairly address 100% of global emissions. It meant that the developed worlds would agree to a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which is the only legally binding instrument that we have to address climate change. There was a compromise struck for the United States, which has long repudiated the Kyoto Protocol, and they said that they would take on action that was comparable to the rest of the world. And lastly, the world agreed to provide technology and finance for developing countries who are currently and will be impacted by this crisis for years to come. Even now, 4 years later, that roadmap remains unimplemented. According to the recent reports by the United Nations and others, the pledges that we got for emissions reductions last year in Cancun will, in the worst-case scenario, deliver a 5 degrees of warming in this world. That level of warming will cause unimaginable human suffering for Americans at home as well as around the world. And yet, here at the talks in Durban, there's a lot of talk about a new mandate to launch a new round of negotiations, even as the existing roadmap and the existing promises that have been made haven't been kept. The new roadmap will possibly delay action by 5 to 10 years as it's negotiated and then ratified. It could possibly be much, much weaker than the system that we have in place now, in which developed countries merely pledge whatever they're willing to do domestically, regardless of whether that in total will yield a safe climate future. And it will also compel, and this is what we understand consists of many of the proposals on the table, to compel developing countries who are least responsible for having caused this problem to take on binding cuts. It's unfair and it won't work. The problem that we have now was caused by the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, and developing countries simply haven't contributed the same amount, and they don't bear the same historic responsibility. So we're in a very dangerous position of, in the next 24 hours, having to shift the talks from the current focus on a new mandate towards delivering on the mandate that we presently have in a fair and equitable fashion.
And when you talk climate change, what does it mean? Let's just start there very concretely.
Concretely, it means that we have been emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it's causing a warming world, and that is going to deliver extreme weather events around the world. The night before the climate talks began, there was a violent storm that whipped through the city of Durban, and it actually killed 8 people when their houses collapsed on them. This is a year that has seen extraordinary weather events. In Pakistan, there were floods. This was the first year in which 47 states around the U.S. declared emergencies based on the extraordinary weather events. These are the kinds of impacts that we'll see. A GRIST report that was written last year, last week, GRIST said that, in an interview that was written on that blog, said that the 4 degrees of warming is incompatible with organized society. This is the level of impact that we're talking about. It's frightening, it's severe, and if we can imagine what that will mean for us in the United States, imagine what that then means for the communities around the world who face health impacts, education, all the other development priorities.
The role of the United States in this and why that matters?
The United States, as I mentioned earlier, has a long history in multilateral affairs of weakening and delaying international deals where they don't have domestic legislation in place. The U.S. position here, of course, is shaped substantially by its failure to secure legislation at home, as well as the polarized politics that we see at home. Here, what they've done is, firstly, by refusing to commit to the Kyoto Protocol, leading an exit strategy from the Kyoto Protocol. Others have followed behind, Canada and Japan among them.
Japan, where Kyoto Protocol was sealed.
Indeed. And now even, they are proposing this far weaker system that's called a pledge and review, where the pledges that countries submit is merely determined by their domestic action and not by the global community's determination of what will keep the world safe.
Professor Michael Dorsey, you and other NGOs like Friends of the Earth have been attending regular briefings from the top U.S. climate negotiators, the U.S. NGOs. Talk about what's been happening there and what have you been saying?
You know, in those briefings, Amy, we've seen, I think, a startling lack of vision, a startling level of obstructionism, of defeatism. And I think one way we could summarize those briefings is that the U.S. State Department diplomacy is about delay, and that kind of delay, pitching us out to 5 or 10 years to just begin a process, it's dangerous for ecosystems, it's dangerous for communities, it's dangerous for the economy. Really what we've seen the U.S. try to force the world to do here is to sort of throw out the baby that's called Kyoto, which is an agreement that's legally binding, and get the world to drink the dirty water, the bath water that's left behind. And it's absolutely unacceptable, the performance that we've seen by these diplomats from the State Department, obstructing, blocking, undermining, engaged in no less than sort of diplomatic brinksmanship. And the future of America is much bigger than this, I think. It's much bigger than this sort of low-intensity democracy that's being practiced by folks in the State Department.
So you've been talking to the climate negotiators. Tell us who they are, Todd Stern and Jonathan Pershing.
Well, you know, Todd Stern is the lead of the delegation here. He's the special envoy for climate, appointed by the president. Jonathan Pershing is the deputy of the team. Pershing is a recognized climate scientist. He spent some time at the World Resources Institute before coming back into government. He was involved in negotiations under President Clinton. So he really knows these issues. But when you press him, when you talk about, you know, what happens when you delay, Jonathan? You know, he sort of spins and equivocates and, you know, nods. But when you keep pressing him, he comes clean and says, well, the damages are going to be big. They're going to be big. But the fact is that kind of diplomacy, it's dangerous. It's dangerous that really the U.S. isn't even thinking about the consequences for their delays, the consequences for not just people in the U.S., which we know will be harmed, which will be harmed, you know, in really unjust ways. So we'll see the destruction and devastation fall upon those that are least responsible in the U.S. and here in Africa. And really, we're going to see communities that are on the margins of society already be harmed first and most, poor people in particular.
So why are they doing it? Why are they doing it if they absolutely understand?
You know, I don't know what animates and motivates Jonathan Pershing. You should get him on the show and ask him yourself.
We've been trying to talk to him through the week. Got a question to Todd Stern at one of the press briefings.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that they won't even engage you and won't engage the American public on this in an open debate, it's an indicator that their day has come to leave the State Department. It's time to get that kind of dirty, delayed diplomacy out and bring in people that at a minimum have the courage to talk about these issues, have the courage to really get into these issues.
I wanted to go to a clip of Senator Inhofe. While no members of the U.S. Congress have traveled to Durban for the climate talks, I'm going to contrast that with Copenhagen, where a whole delegation led by Nancy Pelosi came to Copenhagen.